Now, despite my channel being named after Factor 5, these guys, I'm mostly recognized for talking about Pac-Man, and even there, I've mostly talked about the platformers, despite this series being most well known for the maze gameplay. So with that, I figured why not take a deep dive into the maze games, why they work, when they haven't, and what games are worth your time. Pac-Man is a game that at first glance is deceptively simple. The aim of the game is laid bare for the player: collect the dots, either avoid or eat the ghosts, and avoid being cornered. Now you might say, wait, so you can get trapped? Isn't that bad game design? And normally the answer would be yes, but here's where the depth of the game really comes in. Not only are the ghosts limited in quantity and always observable, but you also have direct control over them as their movement is tied to your position. Being cornered is a direct result of your poor decision making. Also, each ghost has a different personality and moves accordingly, so you're always encouraged to analyze their behavior. Doing this, you can also find ways to trick the ghosts and exploit their weaknesses. So despite being so visually simple, there ends up being a lot of meat to the bones here. Yet it can all be figured out just by playing the game and analyzing what's in front of you. The core tenets of Pac-Man's design philosophy are control and strategy. From there, the series had a split between the sequels. The ones made by Midway more or less kept the rules and fundamentals of Pac-Man the same, while finding different ways to apply them. It's Pac-Man with more stage variety. It's Pac-Man with scrolling. It's Pac-Man combined with pinball. And it's Pac-Man, but terrible. The ones made by Namco themselves, however, were more experimental. Super Pac-Man had you navigate a maze, collecting keys that would unlock fruit, which would allow you to complete the round. Or, you could just smash through with full force. Who needs keys when you have total destruction? Pac and Pal takes the general gameplay of Super, removes the titular game-breaking mechanic, and introduced Miru. What is Miru? Nobody knows. What we do know is what Miru is not. Your pal. The title is a dirty lie. She steals the fruit and brings it to the ghost zone. You have to eat all of the fruit before she can steal it all. Then again, who knows? Pac-Man having a weird, overly innocent definition of friendship honestly seems pretty in character for the guy. After that, Namco took a hard left turn and revolutionized an emerging genre just because they could. God, I miss old Namco. So the Namco games were far more variable overall, but then the Midway deal ended altogether, and afterwards Namco just kind of followed Midway's lead, at least with the maze games. Take the foundation of the original and find ways to expand upon it. Pacmania is Pac-Man, both in isometric perspective. More ghosts on a maze, a jump move, and one of the more memorable soundtracks in the series. It's a great maze game and definitely the best since Miss Pac-Man at the time. Though, a word of warning, while the game is genuinely a great time for the first rotation, do yourself a favor and stop after beating Jungly Steps. Like a lot of arcade games, after beating it, you play it again, but harder. But here, a lot of the challenge comes from not being able to react to what's coming for you due to the screen crunch. It's flat out unfair, and the last round in particular is absolutely ridiculous. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here, you have been warned. However, despite the maze formula solidifying, they didn't stop doing things like Pac-Land. Rather, there were now two branches of Pac-Man games, the maze games and pretty much everything else. They experimented with puzzle games, platformers, weird point-and-click motion simulators, you name it. Though there was a period of time during the 16-bit console generation where there weren't new maze games. It was just the weird experiments alongside some ports of the older games. This era is definitely interesting and has charm to it, but it was clear that the series had gone downhill as the peaks weren't hitting as high or as often as they were in the 80s. But a renaissance was on the horizon, kicking off with PacMan Arrangement in 1996. This game is outstanding. It has varied levels, multiple themes, a final boss so you're actually working your way to an end goal, more power-ups, and stage elements like speed pads, ramps, a competitive co-op hybrid multiplayer mode, and a new ghost, Kinky. Yes, that is their name. When out and about, Kinky is always scared and can be used as another power pellet, as eating them will scare the other ghosts. However, Kinky can also fuse with the other ghosts, granting them extra abilities, which present more of a threat, but they're worth more points when eaten. So there's all this new strategy introduced just through all of these kinky options. It's without a doubt one of the absolute best maze games, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. Then the World era began proper, kicking off with PacMan World in 1999. I'm not going to focus too much on these games this time, but I will touch on their maze gameplay for a little bit. PacMan World 1's mazes try some interesting things. The mazes are themed after each level, and they try to throw in some environmental hazards. Unfortunately, this doesn't work out so well and adds some cheap difficulty into the equation. This is made even worse by the fact that you're working with the health and lives you had in the actual levels. So if you lose a life here, you lose a life in the game proper. It's nice to see some experimentation here, as well as some elements from Miss Pac-Man like the moving fruit, but ultimately these are one of the weaker aspects of the original. World 2 makes some much needed tweaks, namely the mazes being given their own live system. Like the original game, you have 3 lives. Lose them all and you're booted out of the maze. No losing lives, no game over, just losing your chance to collect the Galaxian item in that run. Given that maze completion is required for 100% completion, and you have 1 attempt per run, the Ghost AI is a tad easier than normal. World 2's mazes have nice theming, but ultimately they play it safe. These mazes are okay. Not much more, not much less. World 3 drops the attempts at theming from the prior 2, instead styling things after the original maze game, so the visual variety is gone. However, gameplay-wise, these are pretty good. These incorporate stage elements from Arrangement, the maze design is tight, and the music is a lot of fun. These are genuinely fun mazes. Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness takes the general maze gameplay and expands it into a puzzle action game with the scope and tone of the World games and absolutely fantastic music. This is another one I wholeheartedly recommend, especially if you can get your hands on the Dreamcast version. But if you can't, the PlayStation version is a perfectly good option. Adventures in Time is more of a straightforward maze game than Maze Madness, but as far as just straight up maze games go, this may just be the most that has ever been done with the formula. You have hills that Pac-Man can slide down quickly but take him longer to walk up. You have stage hazards like in World 1, but with a jump like in Pacmania to work with that. And there's a lot of variety in these hazards and elements. You also have multiple levels, and by that I don't mean multiple mazes, I mean mazes have layers in this game. They even throw in scenarios and additional stage-specific objectives that mesh really well with what you're already doing. Like in the World games and Maze Madness, ghosts wear different costumes to coincide with each environment, but this goes even further with that concept than those games did. Granted, there are some mini-games that kind of cheapen the experience, and while the themes, elements, and scenarios are varied, the layouts are largely based off of the original maze, so that can get repetitive. But as far as maze games go, this is one of the best. Then we have another PC maze game, Miss Pac-Man Quest for the Golden Maze. This one just kinda sucks. The presentation feels very cheap, the ghost AI feels off, the maze layouts include things like dead ends, long stretches, and aren't always aligned as cleanly as you'd expect a maze game to be. There are some neat power-ups and little touches, but overall this feels like something you'd download on Real Arcade back in the day, not something you'd pick up in the store. To compensate for that, here's Pac-Man Vs. This was a multiplayer GameCube game that took advantage of the Game Boy Advance connectivity. The player with the Game Boy Advance plays as Pac-Man, while the players playing on the TV play as the ghosts trying to find him. Not only is that a great idea, but the mazes are well designed and fun to traverse. It includes music from Pacmania and Arrangement. Mario is the announcer.
Pac-Man ate a power pellet!
And it's one of the best multiplayer games on the GameCube, which, considering the other multiplayer offerings on the system, is quite the accomplishment. It's also been ported to the Switch as part of the Namco Museum, so pick that up if that's the more convenient option. So that's the late 90s to early 2000s, and honestly, on the whole, this was a great time for Pac-Man. Looking at the maze games of the 80s, which ones stand out to me as among the best in the series? Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, and Pacmania. Not a very controversial answer either. I imagine that this is the answer a lot of people would give. But here, it's literally everything except Quest for the Golden Maze. Then on top of that, you had games of other genres. When you include those, you have PacMan World, PacMan World 2, Pac-N-Roll, and PacMan World Rally on top of that. Of course, you had a fair share of mediocre stuff and a couple of bad games too, but overall, not only is the good to bad ratio pretty good, if anything I'd argue better than a lot of the other mascots at the time, but the track record for excellent games is probably the most consistent it has ever been. And even then, the bad games are far from the lows this series reaches, trust me, we're gonna get there. But times were changing, and this direction was dropped around the time of the Bandai merger.